Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Waters, the director and head librarian here at the New York Society Library. We're very glad to have you all here tonight for the program. And I see a lot of faces that I don't recognize. So if this is your first time to the New York Society Library, welcome. We have just celebrated our 270th year. In fact, we are in our 271st year this year. We were founded in 1754. We are open to all, and we have many, many programs and wonderful events like tonight. So we really urge you to check out our catalog and our events calendar and see what we've got on. We'd love to have you back. So first of all, I would love to ask you to please silence your cell phones or anything that might make noise so that we don't interrupt the presentation tonight. We are very honored to have with us tonight Diane Kiesel and Michael Wolraich. Wolraich. I just spent time asking him how to pronounce his name, and there I've got it wrong already. Michael Wolraich is the author of the critically acclaimed Unreasonable Man, Theodore Roosevelt and the Republican Rebels Who Created Progressive Politics, and most recently, The Bishop and the Butterfly, Murder, Politics, and the End of the Jazz Age. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, The Daily Beast, New York Magazine, Reuters, and CNN. Of The Bishop and the Butterfly, the New York Times said, Wolraich brings a journalist's eye and a novelist's elegance to the story of Jazz Age New York. And the Washington Post said, Wolraich weaves together characters as effectively as E.L. Doctorow did in novels such as Ragtime and Billy Bathgate. But the real star remains the city of New York in all of its contradiction, ever elegant and seedy, uplifting and soul-crushing, progressive and reactionary. And we're particularly excited to have Diane Kiesel back with us after a wonderful participation in a biography panel that we had about a year ago. She is a retired judge of the New York Supreme Court. Her books include She Can Bring Us Home, Dr. Dorothy Boulding Farabee, Civil Rights Pioneer, and Domestic Violence, Law, Policy, and Practice. Her new book, When Charlie Met Joan, is, as the Washington Independent Review of Books calls it, a terrific tale of old Hollywood and a legal system gone awry. Publishers Weekly calls the new book fizzy, I love that, and a meticulous retelling of a choice bit of Tinseltown melodrama. This will change how readers see Chaplin. We have copies of both authors' books for sale by our friends from the corner bookstore. Sasha is in the back of the room, and I'm sure the authors would love to sign them afterwards. So again, welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to Diane and Michael.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Well, Diane, it's an honor to be here with you discussing your wonderful book.
Thank you.
And wonderfully fizzy book.
Whatever that means.
The book it's alive. It moves. It's exciting. It's so I get the fizzy. I actually, so when I was growing up, my parents had an old 8mm film projector, and we would use it for home movies. But we would also go to the library and check out the silent films that we could watch on our projector, set up the screen in the living room. And Charlie Chaplin was one of my favorites, one of my whole family's favorites. And reading your book inspired me to introduce Chaplin to my daughter, who's just turned 9. So we've watched a few of his since then. She's really enjoyed it. It's a little bit different experience now. It's streaming on Max, but the magic is still there. So it was kind of exciting and nostalgic for me in a way. So let's introduce to the audience. Let's set this up. Tell us what the book is about, and we'll proceed from there.
Okay. Well, Charlie Chaplin was probably the world's first rock star. He made 66 silent movies as The Little Tramp from 1914 through 1936, and he was the most recognizable man in the world, and probably one of the richest men in America during the Jazz Age. You have to understand, at that time, There was no streaming. There was no television. Everybody went down to the local movie house on Saturday, paid their nickel, and saw the latest Chaplin film and couldn't wait for the next Saturday when the new one would come out. Chaplin is unrecognizable outside of his little tramp costume. Everybody knows the little tramp costume, the mustache, the little derby, the oversized pants and shoes. Without that costume on, he was handsome, he was debonair, he was wealthy, and he was catnip to women. Women loved Charlie Chaplin, and more importantly, Charlie Chaplin loved the ladies. And I shouldn't say ladies, I should say girls, because he was well known for his assignations with teenagers. His first 2 marriages to teenage girls were at the end of a shotgun. And he had affairs with just about every woman he put in his movies. My book is about Chaplin and one of those women. Her name, she started out life as Mary Louise Gribble from Brooklyn, and Chaplin transformed her into the much more glamorous Joan Barry. They met in 1941. He put her under contract within 2 weeks of meeting her, claimed she had innate acting ability. She also had beautiful fiery red hair, was very shapely. And within about 2 weeks of within 2 weeks of meeting her, he signs a contract. Within days after that, they're having a sexual affair. And within about a month, she gets pregnant, and pregnant again, and has a series of abortions. And Chaplin realizes very quickly that this woman is trouble because she came from a family background which had a history of suicides. She became something of a stalker when Chaplin tried to back off of their sexual relationship. And the long and short of it is, thanks to his relationship with her, he ends up indicted for violating the Mann Act and for conspiring with others to run her out of California when she becomes so problematic as a stalker, and he's fearful it's going to turn into a scandal that will ruin his career. And so my book is actually the only book that focuses solely on a series of trials that grew out of his relationship with this woman.
It's really, there's a lot of intrigue and a lot of twists and turns, and some great descriptions of the trials and of their relationship. I'm curious, what inspired you to write about Chaplin in general and this particular moment in Chaplin's life in particular?
Well, I was inspired for the dullest of reasons, okay? I had no real interest in Chaplin. I had seen, The Great Dictator. I had seen Modern Times on Turner Classic Movies. I was not a big Chaplin aficionado. But I was writing a second edition of my Domestic Violence and the Law textbook. Okay? All right. And in that book, I have a chapter on child abuse and custody. And so I was just looking around the internet for articles about custody. And I came up with a 1952 Law Review article that talked about the great injustice to Charlie Chaplin that led to a revamping of paternity laws nationwide. And I'm like, what great injustice, Charlie Chaplin paternity laws? And it turned out that this same woman, and I'm talking about Joan Barry, after all of the federal trials were over, she accused him of being the father of a child she did not abort. A child who was born about a year after their relationship ended. Well, not really a year, more like 9 to 10 months after their relationship ended. Except Chaplin's blood type was O, Mom's blood type was A, and the baby's blood type was B. Who still remembers their high school biology? Is this Charlie Chaplin's kid? No. But she sued him anyway, and in 1944 in California, the results of a blood test in a paternity proceeding were admissible in court, but they weren't dispositive of anything. A jury could reject that evidence, just like it could reject any other evidence. And the jury in this case rejected the evidence. Now you ask, why would the jury reject science like this? Well, we can blame Charlie Chaplin himself, because the first trial ended up in a mistrial. The jurors
that was the Mann Act.
No.
Oh.
This is the paternity trial.
Paternity trial.
Paternity trial now. Mann Act, he got acquitted.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
I just wanted first trial.
First trial, he got acquitted.
Yeah.
That's the one that we can talk about, the media craziness. But the second trial is the one that led to the great injustice against Chaplin, because first trial, there's a mistrial. The jury was really divided between whether they were going to accept that science or reject it. But the problem is, in the first trial, the lawyer representing the baby, because the baby was the litigant in the case, was amazingly disrespectful to Chaplin, and the judge allowed him to get away with it. While on the witness stand, he referred to him as a cheap Cockney cad, a runt of a Svengali. Chaplin was 5'4". And Chaplin was so infuriated and so insulted that for the retrial, he just didn't come back. Now, in a civil case, you don't have to show up unless you're being called as a witness. So he just never came back, which insulted and upset the 11 women jurors on the 12-member jury. Because remember, Chaplin was popular with the ladies. I'm sure they all wanted to be on that jury so they could get to see the still handsome, great Chaplin. He doesn't show up. They figure, well, if he doesn't care about this, why should we? They 11-1 verdict against Chaplin.
But it was established science at that point. I mean, the judge himself seemed to accept that this was a flawed verdict.
It was absolutely accepted science. Chaplin appealed and Joan Barry appealed. In the end, Chaplin ended up paying $100 a week in child support for 21 years for a child that was not his. Joan was furious because he was worth millions, and her lawyer's view was $100 a week from this millionaire. But the court, I think, was sending a real message, which was, this is not this man's child, and this is about as far as we're going to go in forcing him to, swallow this bitter pill. Within 5 years, legislatures around the country that hadn't already had laws that said, once a paternity test says it's not you, Dad, you can go home, ended up changing their laws for in just that way. But it was too late for Chaplin. He was covered by the verdict.
So he couldn't appeal or re-challenge. Not
Nope.
that he probably would have wanted to go back to through that again.
Exactly. You know that all of these trials were extraordinarily upsetting to him as a person for whom his reputation mattered. When you're in the public eye, you don't need a bad reputation. And the problem with these trials were it put public focus on behavior that had been quietly whispered about in Beverly Hills for years, which is that Charlie Chaplin, the 50-plus-year-old man, 54 at the time this was all happening, while he was in the middle of this, he was going out with 17-year-old Una O'Neill, who he ended up marrying shortly after she turned 18. That marriage was actually successful. They stayed together until he died in 1977 and had 8 children together. But he always was looked upon as kind of a, predator against young women, and now it was all on the front pages of every newspaper in the world. So the trial was very distressing to him.
So that notion of a predator, of a powerful Hollywood mogul preying on young women, that is something that, of course, has a lot of resonance today. You started writing this. It was during the Me Too that you were writing this, or just after?
The Me Too movement emerges about the end of 2017. And I started writing this book started thinking about it in 2018 and really started working on it in 2019. And I think there are parallels there. Certainly, Chaplin was no Harvey Weinstein. He was not. He was with willing women, but one has to ask themselves, well, isn't there a power imbalance between a 54-year-old multimillionaire and a teenage girl who wants to be a star? And I think the looking at this through 21st century eyes changes the way you look at Chaplin during all of this. His behavior doesn't seem as charming as it did to his contemporaries.
And yet he was also, Joan Barry was not exactly an angel either. And what I found kind of fascinating about your book and was impressed by was how even-handed you were in relating the story and kind of presenting both sides, not whitewashing Charlie Chaplin, but nor demonizing him.
Well, that's 25 years as a judge. You've got to, you've got to see both sides of what's in front of you and do your best to be fair and impartial. Look, Chaplin and Joan were both victim and victimizer. Joan Barry's grandmother and father committed suicide. Joan her stepfather was a grifter and a criminal who did hard time in jail. Joan was probably bipolar. She was a prescription drug and alcohol abuser. She was desperate for love and desperate to find somebody to take care of her. When she graduated from high school, she makes her way to Hollywood and immediately falls into the orbit of rich and powerful men. She dated John Paul Getty. She dated Getty's, and by the way, she dated Getty while he was in the middle of his marriage to his fifth wife. While she
was seeing Chaplin, right?
She was seeing Chaplin, she was sort of seeing where she was going to get her better deal. She dated Getty's lawyer. At the same time she was seeing Getty. She dated an international race car driver. And this one is going to shock the judges sitting here in the audience tonight because there are a few. She also went out with the judge who presided over the Mann Act trial in which she was a witness, okay? And he never told anybody. And Getty showed up as a witness in that trial, and the judge was a buddy of Getty's, and he never told anybody that either. So that's a whole other story. But when Joan felt that she was losing her hold on Chaplin, she lost it. She started calling him and coming to his house. When he wouldn't open the door, she would break in. Excuse me.
Once with a gun.
Well, that's the big night, and that's probably the night that led her to believe that Chaplin might be the father of her kid. She tells Chaplin around September of 1942, after they've been together about a year, and by the way, he bought a script for her to make her a star and sent her to drama school. She stopped going. It was just all falling apart. So she tells Chaplin she wants to go back to New York and get married. There's nobody in New York that's going to marry her, but she wants to make Chaplin jealous. He doesn't make him jealous. He immediately buys her a train ticket and says, goodbye, good luck, okay? However, Chaplin also was going around the country at that time making these what they call second front speeches. During World War II, the Russians wanted the United States to enter the war, a ground war in Europe, to help them fight the Nazis. Eventually, we did it. We had the D-Day invasion. But the Russians wanted us to do it a lot sooner. They enlisted Chaplin, who was very left-leaning, had a lot of pro-Soviet friends, to go around the country calling for this open up this second front. The government hated him for doing that. We'll put that aside because that gets into Chaplin as being persecuted, as being red, if you will. But a month after Joan goes back to New York, Chaplin goes back to New York to Madison Square Garden to make one of these second front speeches. Joan catches wind of it. She goes to see the speech on the arm of Getty's lawyer, and they connect, and they probably have sex at the Waldorf Astoria. Joan complains to him that she has no money. He gives her a few $100s, and what does she do? She goes back to California and commences stalking him. He finally says to her, "It's over. Leave me alone. Do not darken my door." And what does she do? This is the gun incident you raise. A few days before Christmas, 1942, she bangs on his door. Nobody answers. She breaks in. She creeps up the stairs. Chaplin's on the phone flirting with some other woman. And she pulls her gun out. And Chaplin basically says, "Gotta go," and she threatens to kill him and or herself. Now, that phone that Chaplin was just on is sitting right next to the man. He could pick up the phone and call the cops. But he doesn't want to do that because how's he going to explain this crazy woman in his house with a gun at midnight, okay? Instead, he sleeps with her. Big mistake. That, of course, disarms her at least for the evening. The next morning, she cries again she's broke. He gives her more money. She leaves, all right? A week later, on New Year's Eve, she breaks into the house again when he won't answer her calls. But this time, he's out. There's a night watchman. The night watchman's not afraid to call the cops. He does. Joan runs away. She's found like a mile away in a car, in a man's pajamas with Chaplin's fur coat over her. She has put iodine on her lips and taken a few sleeping pills, and now she's making believe that she is at death's door from committing suicide in the hope that Chaplin will come and rescue her. Instead, so she gets arrested for vagrancy. Now you're asking, why is a woman who is, supposedly at death's door and an extremist getting arrested for vagrancy? This is Beverly Hills in 1942. They don't want people around who are trouble. And Joan has become a pest. And so she's in the lockup. She thinks Chaplin is going to come and rescue her on New Year's Day. Instead, he sends a factotum who convinces an unethical arraignment judge and the police to run her out of town. And that's exactly what happens. And that ends up these two events end up forming the basis for Chaplin's indictments because he went to New York, they had sex there, he gave her $300, she came back, thus the Mann Act, sending a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. That's indictment one. The other three indictments are Chaplin and his buddies who get the judge and the cops to run her out of town. Conspiracy to violate Joan's civil rights. All of those four indictments come back and bite Chaplin in this very, very public trial. And the biggest bite of all is having had sex with her on 2 days before Christmas, because then she was able to come back 5 months later, 5 months pregnant, and say, "Look what you did, Charlie." And by the way, she demanded $150,000, which is about $2.5 million today, and or marry me. But by then he was seeing Una O'Neill. He was not marrying her. And that's how Charlie got into this mess.
And then you had the trial, which is, we're 21st century. We're well familiar with celebrity trials. But this was, would you say this was the first of its kind?
Well, no, the first of its kind was really the Lindbergh kidnapping trial in the 30s. But this one was a close second because the rule that prohibited cameras in the federal courts was not in existence then, and the judge, Joan's little ex-boyfriend there, Judge J.F.T. O'Connor, a Roosevelt appointee, he liked the press attention, and he allowed cameras into the court in that trial. There were photographers from all over the world. There were people waiting online for hours to get into the federal courthouse to see this case. And by the way, these were a lot of women came to see this trial. The same women who were once Chaplin fans standing in line to see his movies were now lined up in the hallway of the courthouse screaming "rat." And they actually had rolled up newspapers and they were hitting him as he was walking into court. The judge, and again, judges in the audience who would allow this, there wasn't enough room for all the people who wanted to see this trial, and the judge allowed them to stand up along the side of the walls and watch this trial. This is something you would never do for security purposes now, okay? And Chaplin hired one of the most well-known lawyers in California, a guy named Jerry Giesler. He was a rock star of his own to the legal community. And people came to see him as much as they came to see Chaplin. And the problem is it was a flimsy indictment from day one. Joan fell apart on the witness stand. Chaplin did his silent scream thing. You know, he wept when he talked about the gun, the night she showed up with the gun, et cetera, et cetera. And he was acquitted in about 5 hours after a 2-week trial. And by the way, after he was acquitted, the courtroom erupted into cheers. The jurors lined up to shake his hand, and at the end of the line was the United States attorney who indicted him, who also shook his hand. And then once the Mann Act case went south, the Justice Department basically said to the U.S. attorney, a young man named Charles Carr, dump the rest of these cases. We're done with being humiliated. Just get out of this as fast as you can. And then I'd say about a year later is when the civil paternity trial went to trial.
So, I mean, we've both written about trials, which is I can be very exciting. Can also be, you know, there's a trap there. You can easily get caught in the legal weeds. You're certainly much more of a legal expert than I am. How did you convey? Because the trials, as I'm sure many people know, are very long. There's so many details that when you read about it in a book or a movie, are left out. So how did you, this is nonfiction, so how did you cover that in a way that you could present it and make it engaging, which I think you very much did, to lay people?
Well, these two trials were very different. Because the federal trials ended up in an acquittal, there was no transcript that went up on appeal. There was a transcript, but the National Archives does not keep them forever. It's long gone. So the federal trial, I had to put together through contemporary newspaper articles about the trial. And one thing that was nice about the contemporary newspaper articles, because there was no CNN, many of these papers did an actual Q&A from the trial. So I had some portion of transcript, but you sort of had to do a lot of backfill based on contemporary accounts. The paternity trial was much different. Because there was an appeal, there was an actual transcript of that trial, and that ended up at the California State Archives, which, you too can have all the pages if you send your $200 and wait patiently in the mail, and that's what I did. I think the key in writing about trials is understanding that for every exciting moment of gotcha cross-examination, there's hours of deadly testimony that to set the stage. And so you've got to be able to weed that out and focus on the exciting stuff. It wasn't hard here, though. You know what to focus on: the gun. Interestingly enough, in the Mann Act trial, Chaplin's lawyer tried very, very hard to paint Joan as a wanton woman. Interestingly enough, the judge, who had been one of the men she had been wanton with, prevented him from getting into a lot of her past sexual history. Frankly, that was the right call. Today, there are rules in most states and in the federal system too, preventing getting into the prior sexual history of a woman in a sexual a case that involves some kind of sex offense.
Do you think he did that for legal reasons, or was he protecting Getty?
That's my question. It's unclear. Getty was married 5 times. He knew Getty was seeing Joan. He had like one date and a couple of dinners with Joan. I don't think the judge's relationship with her was all that deep, but he knew his good friend Getty was seeing her. I went to the Getty archive and also looked online. Getty kept copious diaries, and he saw Joan 100 times between the fall of 1940 and the spring of 1942. By the way, the spring of 1943. By the way, when I think he learned she was pregnant. He never says that in his diary, but she calls him in April of 43 for some unknown reason. And after that, he makes her sign a paper that says, "I will never ask J. Paul Getty for any money again." And he never has any more contact with her. So that's very interesting. But it's a long answer to your question. We'll never know whether he was doing the right evidentiary call or protecting his friend. And by the way, you're no slouch when it comes to trial reporting or writing either. In Michael's book, he has one of the best entries, and you picked only the good stuff. The corrupt mayor, Jimmy Walker. The corrupt mayor named Jimmy Walker was the subject of the Seabury Commission investigation in the 30s, and there is this moment during this investigation when somebody named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York, decides all of a sudden to put his law degree to use and do one of the best cross-examinations of Walker I've ever read. It's amazing, and that's in The Bishop and the Butterfly. So
Yeah, not even technically a court of law, but yes,
Yes.
it
Oh,
was
it's
like
great.
a 3-week
It's a-
interrogation.
and he rips Walker apart. The next thing you know, Walker resigns, takes his 100 suits, his 100 made-to-measure suits, and all his neckties and his girlfriend, and moves to Europe. He and Chaplin would have been good friends, I think.
Mayor Adams has not yet been called up to Albany. So
Kathy Hochul went to my law school. I would hope that she would be able to do a good cross-examination if need
I
be.
think I think FDR had the right idea. It was. I mean, well, he was a brilliant politician. But getting back to Chaplin, I mean, Chaplin, we've kind of alluded to this a little bit. He's become an icon of Hollywood now in a way that at this time he was no longer. He'd fallen out of grace.
He was an icon, he falls out of grace, and then history makes him an icon again.
Yes, and a martyr, I think, is a term that you've used because of his persecution for political views and being deported. So you have a more nuanced view of him, I think, than many do today. And I don't know if you want to kind of talk about what his politics was, what his real stature historically is.
Well, look, Chaplin was victimized by the government in the United States. There's no doubt about that. And I think it would be unfair of me not to acknowledge that, recognize it. His childhood is horrible. He ends up in orphanage schools when his father dies at age 37 and his mother goes insane. I raise this because he was 11 years old and he could barely read. He comes to America, he makes it big, and now he's somewhat uncomfortable about his lack of formal education. So he takes up with a lot of intellectuals, a lot of very intelligent left-leaning thinkers, and he adopts a lot of their ideas. But unlike them, who they sit around, over dinner and talk about it, when Chaplin opens his mouth, the whole world listens, right? So the government is very annoyed, upset, and concerned. And from 1922 on, there is an FBI file on Chaplin as a potential communist, and it's absurd. It's filled with a lot of, Chaplin had dinner, with this Polar Bolsheviki, and Chaplin gave $25 to the Liberator magazine.
I mean, you say the government, but it was. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover
J. Edgar
took
Hoover.
a personal interest in pursuing him.
Absolutely, because of his celebrity. So he was always on their radar screen. Now, because he never became a citizen, every time he wants to leave the country, like any other resident alien, you have to get a reentry permit to come back. He decides, long after this trial is over, almost a decade afterward, that he's going to go with his young family now to London to the opening premiere of his movie Limelight. He applies for a reentry permit. He gets one, okay? And while he's on the Queen Elizabeth in the middle of the Atlantic, the Attorney General, McGranary at the time, pulls it. and says, nope, Charlie Chaplin is not welcome back in this country anymore. And the excuse is his moral failings because of the Joan Barry trials, his communist beliefs or tendencies, and the fact that he hasn't been sufficiently respectful to America. Okay? Chaplin does not fight this. And I think this is a big mistake because there are 6,500 pages of INS files on Chaplin, along with the 2,000 pages of FBI files. I've read them all. There is nothing in those 6,500 pages except a lot of memos back and forth that say, we don't really, if he decides to challenge this, I don't know if we're going to be able to prevail. That he would have prevailed. But I think that after the horrible, what he went through for 3 years with the Mann Act indictments, the trial, the two paternity trials, they cost him a fortune. His lawyer charged him $60,000. Jerry Giesler, that's the equivalent of about $1 million today. Chaplin was a tightwad. He didn't want to spend the kind of money, and he didn't want to go through the emotional turmoil. He basically said, the heck with it. He moved to Switzerland. He stayed there. He died there in 1977. But he came back one last time, and it's very interesting, his return. It's 1972, and America is turning now from the right, where it was in 1952 when it gave Chaplin the boot, to the left. The Vietnam War is raging. Nobody in Hollywood is terribly happy with that. Now they want to recognize Chaplin and give him an honorary Oscar. But he can't come back to this country without having to prove himself as a good citizen or a good visitor. Okay, Bob Hope, Mr. GOP right-wing Republican, wants Chaplin back. And he goes to the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland and says, I think you should call John Mitchell and let Attorney General John Mitchell and let Chaplin back. Why does Bob Hope do this? Because when Bob Hope was a little boy, he won a Chaplin look-alike contest, which started his career. And there was a place in his heart for Chaplin. And it works. Chaplin comes back. He goes to Hollywood in April of 1972. He gets this honorary award. By this time, he is such an unrecognizable old man. He literally shuffles onto the stage. And he gets the longest standing ovation. I think it's a full 3 minutes in Oscar history. Not before or since has anybody got that kind of standing ovation. But ask yourself, Hollywood was the centerpiece of the Me Too movement just a few years ago. Would all of those men and women jump up and cheer for Chaplin today, knowing what we know about his relationship with women? Again, I don't know the answer to that. So while Chaplin was a victim of the Red Scare, absolutely, he brought a lot of this on himself. So
that might. I didn't bring a watch. Are we? When do we? When
I
we
don't
break
know.
for questions?
Does Sayer or Carolyn come with a big hook?
There's no hook. You want to continue a few minutes, and then we'll do a little Q&A.
Okay, just interrupt me when it's time to do the questions. So we've talked about what happened with Chaplin's life. What about Joan's?
Oh, Joan. No, it's really very, very tragic. Joan, who had mental health issues to begin with, after her relationship with Chaplin ends, after the trial's over and she gets her $100 a week for her child, she moves to Pittsburgh, she marries a train conductor, she has 2 other children with him, and she embarks on this career. And I keep thinking of Susan Alexander Kane from the movie Citizen Kane when she becomes kind of an alcoholic singing in like these little dives. Joan becomes a lounge singer in third-rate bars and taverns and venues, and she's terrible. She gets terrible reviews, and she divorces the train conductor husband. She makes her way back to California, and then she loses her mind. She gets committed to the Patton State Mental Hospital in Southern California for a full decade. And her little girl named Carol Ann, who is still alive and is 81 years old, ends up being, goes to a Catholic boarding school, which she actually liked and was happy there. And she only saw her mother 2 more times after her mother was committed to the mental hospital.
You interviewed Carolyn.
Oh, she was like my new best friend throughout this entire book. I interviewed her multiple times. There are pictures in the book from her attic. She fully cooperated with the book, largely because she and her half-brother, her only surviving half-brother, had no idea whatever happened to their mother. And they wanted me to be a time-traveling detective and find her. So I found her. She died in 2007 at the age of 87 in a Brooklyn nursing home. And how she got there, who knows? She died under the name Mary L. Baker, but I know it was her because it was the same Social Security number Joan Barry / Mary Louise Gribble was always using, and same date of birth, and same parents listed. So she was buried in an unmarked grave down the Jersey Shore in Morganville, New Jersey. And her son actually came to visit her. In 18 years, by the way, the graves had 2 visitors, me and the son. And the son bought her a little cemetery plot that she now has with her name and her date of birth and date of death. But it ended up very tragically.
So, I mean, speaking of Joan, one challenge that I've often found as in writing narrative nonfiction is dealing with unreliable narrators, because you want to tell the story, you want the detail that the narrators are providing, you want to show their side of the story, but you can't be sitting there constantly fact checking, and you don't want to mislead. But on the other hand, you don't want to mislead your readers. So, and I mean, Joan is probably one of the most unreliable narrators that I've read about recently, and
Yes.
I was very impressed with how you managed to make that work, how you sort of showed empathy for Joan and presented her perspective and her story without accepting everything that she said as gospel. So I'm curious how you approached that. What were the challenges?
Well, the FBI did a lot of my work for me because there's 2,000 pages of FBI files on Chaplin, and I would say half of it is the investigation for this trial. They went out and interviewed, first of all, J. Edgar Hoover got onto this story because when Chaplin wouldn't give Joan the $150,000 she wanted for this pregnancy or marry her, Joan went to Hedda Hopper and tattled and said, "I'm pregnant, Charlie Chaplin's the father, look, he's abandoned me." Hedda Hopper hated Charlie Chaplin because she was very conservative, she hated his politics, she hated the fact that he owned his own studio and he didn't have to kowtow to her.
She was the journalist.
Oh, yes, Hedda Hopper was a famous columnist in the 40s. She wrote this column, she wore a big hat, it was called Under Hedda's Hat. And so she exposed this affair, and a friend of hers who was named Flora Bell Muir, who was the New York Daily News Hollywood correspondent, also wrote about it, and J. Edgar Hoover was mesmerized by these stories, and he wrote a teletype to the the head of the LA FBI office saying, "Shouldn't we track this down?" And that's what got this ball rolling, and 5,000 FBI agents fanned out all across the country and started interviewing people. They interviewed 130 people, either suspects, witnesses, Joan 1,000,000 times. And what would happen is when Joan would tell something that just didn't have the ring of truth, the agents would go out and investigate, and then they'd come back and they'd confront Joan, or they'd send teletypes to Hoover or to each other saying, well, this doesn't check out, that checks out. So you could sort of use the other witnesses to circle Joan and tease out what was truthful and what was, her exaggeration or her wishes. And
were they? I mean, were they Hoover and the others? Do you think they were genuinely concerned about dangerous subversion from Chaplin, or they were rather trying to make an example of him for their agenda and to make a point?
That's a hard one. Charles Carr, the United States Attorney in Los Angeles, had just been appointed by Roosevelt a few months before this case broke. He was in his early 40s. He was very ambitious, and most of the cases that U.S. attorneys had during the war were prosecuting people who were cheating on their ration coupons or sending phony chain letters in soldiers' names. So this was a hot case that was going to make his career. So he was excited about it. Hoover was only too happy to have Chaplin's scalp in his basket if he could. But the Maine Department of Justice was somewhat skeptical about this case. And when they had meetings, when Carr would go back to Washington to report on what was going on, they repeatedly told him, Tom Clark, who was the chief assistant at the time, who later became a Supreme Court justice, they kept telling him, slow down here. Be sure that you've got the goods. There's no rush here to indict this woman. Carr wanted to go forward with the conspiracy case, how everybody conspired to run Joan out of town. It was Maine justice that thought, well, if we're going to do this, let's do the Mann Act case, obviously, because it's sexier and it'll get more attention. But what ultimately ended up happening is when it all went south, then everybody, as always happens in this world, right, everybody wanted to disavow it. Justice, well, Carr went ahead without us. Carr's like, well, justice forced me to do it. Even J. Edgar Hoover finally said, look, let's just drop this whole thing. We're just going to make a martyr out of this guy. And they bided their time, and they got him. They got him 10 years later when he tried to leave the country. One other thing about Chaplin leaving the country, he wanted to leave the country about 5 years earlier to take Una and the kids on a little world tour of Europe. And the Immigration Naturalization Service sent a lawyer to interview him, as they do before you leave the country. And I think from the tone of that interview, Chaplin got a little spooked and realized, uh-oh, they're after me. Because all of the questions 5 years earlier were about Joan, were about his communist ties, and they kept at it for like 4 hours until finally Chaplin loses it and he says, look, I'm worth $30 million. Why are you guys talking to me about communism? And to me, that was one of the most honest lines what was wrong with them? What were they thinking? Chaplin was as communist as, Hoover probably was. I mean, he loved money and he loved success and he earned every bit of it.
And yet they came after him even, after this. And this time he did leave the country.
And this time he did leave the country. And again, I think that he could have won if he had fought it, but there was no fight left in him after what happened. So yes, he was partially victimized, but look what happened to poor Joan. She's a great example of what happens to young people who go out to Hollywood. They think they're going to make it, and they don't. And in 1944, without an education and without family money and a family history of mental illness, she was kind of lost.
Yeah.
I think we might move to Q&A.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a microphone to hand somebody who's got a question. Somebody with a question.
The amount of research that went into this must have been extraordinary. So, can you hear me or not? So I guess my question is, how long and what types of, you already mentioned the newspaper articles that recounted the trial, but what other types of sources did you use, and how long did it take you to kind of arrive at a picture that you felt was sufficiently complete to present a book proposal and the idea for the shell of the entire story?
Well, it took me about a year to do the book proposal. But the book proposal is merely an outline, a couple of chapters, and a marketing plan. Once the book got accepted for publication, then I really jumped into it. I guess I was working at the time, and judges in New York get 5 weeks of vacation, very generous, and every 5 weeks, every summer, I was in California doing research at the National Archives there, at the Margaret Herrick Library. The Margaret Herrick Library is the repository for everything involving the Academy Awards. And that was a gold mine because I got to see the Academy Awards show where he won his award. There are all kinds of unpublished manuscripts by people who knew Chaplin, who were aware of in his orbit during these trials. So I looked at all of those memoirs. I was at the National Archives. The Getty Diaries. The Getty Diaries were a gold mine because that man kept these books about everything. Got up, took my pills. He was a major league hypochondriac. He had a lot of facelifts, which he talked about a lot. Always had a bellyache, and it was filled with all of these meetings with Joan, and that actually answers your question, because when Joan would say she was doing one thing, I would look at Getty's diary and see they were actually doing something else. So Getty was he was a gentleman, though. There's not one mention of any sexual contact whatsoever in this diary with Joan. Anyway, the New York Public Library, I think I went everywhere. Every old newspaper, you can get them on ProQuest online if you go to the library. I looked up the LA Times, the New York Times, the LA Herald Examiner, and then finally, all the secondary sources. This is not a brand new story. It shows up as a chapter or two in every biography of Chaplin, but it doesn't go very deep. But still, I read what everybody else had to say about this, and you put it all together in a big soup. And you stir and cook until it's done.
The newspapers, and I found this in my writing too, they're, especially the way they wrote back then, they're great for just adding color to these trials. So it's not just, often they have the transcript, but in the article, but it's not just the transcript. It's also, what people were wearing and, how Charlie Chaplin looked and what expressions he had.
And there were famous people who covered this trial. Adela Rogers St. John's, who was one of these sob sister writers during the 1930s, she was there. The Hedda Hopper was there, and Sheila Graham was there, and just all of these famous names in journalism. And you're right, they talk about, Hedda Hopper talked about how the ladies on the jury, who were all flirting up a storm with Chaplin during the whole federal trial, it was a beautiful spring day, and they broke out their spring hats. One woman actually sat there in a hat and gloves during the trial, looking at her Sunday best. Another thing that I did, Ancestry.com is such a gold mine of information. I knew everybody was dead. This trial was 80 years ago, but people have children and grandchildren. And I just went through and looked up names and places and who lived where, and I found a number of the children of jurors. I found the daughter of the Chicago Tribune reporter, Marcia Wynn, who covered this like every single minute and interviewed her about her mother. So there's a lot of ways to, I hate this expression, skin the cat. That's a horrible expression. Ugh, but there are a lot of ways to do that.
In the course of bonding with Joan's daughter, did you not discuss her thoughts about who her father was?
Yes, it's very interesting. She was raised by her grandmother until she was sent off to boarding school. Her mother was considered as good as dead to the family because the grandmother was a pious Catholic who hated Joan's behavior, okay? Her mother's mother. And so her parentage, mom or dad, was never discussed at home. She heard rumors when she was in high school that there was something, her mother had something to do, because remember, by now her mother's in a mental hospital, she hasn't seen her for years. Her mother had something to do with somebody famous, maybe Charlie Chaplin, and she went to the public library one day and found an old Life magazine article about her mother and Chaplin. And then she realized why everything was so hush-hush and secret. So in the course of my interviews with her, we talked about who the father might be. I had some thoughts, like these 5 men I know of who Joan had access to during the particular period of time that she was conceived. But the only way to figure it out, and we talked about this, would Carol Ann. The only rule was I would never say what her real last name is now, but would Carol Ann be willing to take one of those 23andMe or Ancestry tests? And she was, but the problem with it is, in order to find out who your ancestor is, you've got to go public so they can connect with you, and she refuses to do that.
The $100,000 that you got between 1942, or someone got, from 42 to 62, was $100,000, right?
Yes, and let me tell you something. This is a very interesting thing that you raised. That Carol Ann's lawyer was this old warhorse named Joe Scott. He was 78 years old when he represented her. He was recruited through the church because the church saw that Joan's mother, this pious Catholic who liked her booze and let her daughter run around with every married guy under the sun, nonetheless, they recruited him, and he took the case pro bono, okay? And he was, of course, very upset when his client only got $100 a week. But be that as it may, as nasty as he was to Chaplin, and as ruthless as he was to Chaplin, he loved this child. There's a picture in the book. She used to go once a month to his law office and play on his secretary's typewriter. When she went off to boarding school, he put every nickel that Chaplin gave her every week in a trust. So, and I mean, this kid could have been completely ripped off. And when she turned 21, she got this money, and it was considerable. She bought a car with it. She was able to, she started a nice life, went to college with it. I mean, it did her. Chaplin's money took care of her, gave her a good life, and it was no real loss to Chaplin. Yeah.
So he continued paying her even though he was in Europe?
He continued paying her. He continued paying her. Mm-hmm.
Hi. You mentioned that the son and you have visited her grave, and the son put a nice headstone out for her.
Yeah.
What name did she use? Marion Barry? The new
No,
name,
he called her Joan Barry. Well, actually, Joan, her name when she was growing up, Gribble blew his head off when she was 6 years old. She got a stepfather named John Berry, Berry, and that's how I think Chaplin came up with Barry, John Berry, and so she was Joan Berry.
I just wanted to know, because there was Fatty Arbuckle as well. How did that play at all in this, or was this a totally separate type of incident, though? So
Fatty Arbuckle was years before. That was in the 20s. And look, Fatty Arbuckle was, I think, probably in the back of Chaplin's mind, frightening him to death. For those of you who don't know, Fatty Arbuckle was a silent film star. His name was Roscoe, but he weighed about 300 pounds, so they called him Fatty, a nickname he hated. And actually, some of the early silents, Chaplin and Fatty, were in the same movies together. And there was a weekend in San Francisco, it's sometime in the late 20s, where Arbuckle was up there in a hotel room having a weekend party, and a woman named Virginia Rapé ended up dying at this party. Nobody knows how she died, but somehow there was an allegation that Arbuckle had raped her, and because he weighed 300 pounds, he had somehow, crushed her to death or something? I don't know. But he went through 3 trials, which were 2 mistrials and then finally an acquittal. And he didn't end up going to jail for the rest of his life, but it completely destroyed his career. And I think that's why Chaplin was so afraid of this scandal. Like, for example, the night that Joan's walking up the stairs with her gun, that's the reason why Chaplin's not picking up the phone, calling the cops. He just wants the whole thing to go away, which is why he tries to get the Beverly Hills police and the judge to run her out of town just to get her away before it gets out into the open.
Well, I might throw in one more question, if you don't mind, and leave
You
it
get
open
a
little
you get a
bit.
question?
I've got a
Oh,
question,
okay.
if that's okay. So just thinking about this in terms of the history of film and of Chaplin's career. So by the time any of this starts happening, I think it's fair to say that Chaplin's career had really almost entirely rounded off, right? He has made all his great films. We now know. I mean, it wasn't necessarily clear to him at the time. He makes one more, perhaps, great film. I mean, I love it, Limelight. After this, the rest of his films after the early 1940s, I mean, unless anybody wants to stand up for Countess from Hong Kong, like, go for it. But I think they're few and far between and not very good. So, does his multi-part downfall have an impact on the history of film, do you think? Or was he pretty much kind of washed up in terms of his impact on other people? I mean, the occasional good thing after that in general. But separately from that, to what extent does his multi-part downfall have an impact on the culture of Hollywood at the time? Are other people warned off of bad behavior? Do other people treat people that they're sleeping with or stalkers or whatever that category?
Oh, no, back then Chaplin was purely the victim. Once he gets acquitted, the pendulum swings back in favor of Chaplin. But you raised something very interesting, which I didn't talk about. There's so much, we could sit here for 9 hours, which nobody wants to do. When Chaplin met Joan Barry in May of 1941, his life was kind of going on a downward trajectory. Paulette Goddard, who was his leading lady and may have been in the wonderful movie Modern Times, which he wrote for her, and The Great Dictator, she may or may not have been his third wife. They always were very coy about whether they were really married, but they were together for 10 years. And until he married Una O'Neill, it was his most successful relationship. Well, that relationship had just ended. The talkies, his last, The Great Dictator, while we look back at that movie now as a masterpiece, it got very mixed reviews at the time. So he was all he did was play tennis all day. And he met Joan on a blind date. Charlie Chaplin has to go on a blind date, but he did. And I think he was very vulnerable. When he met her, he was going to make her this star in a serious movie called Shadow and Substance. He paid $20,000 for a script, for which at $20,000, and we're talking about, six figures today, that he was going to make her a star. And then, of course, they had this affair, and he finds out that she's not going to drama school, and she starts breaking into his house, and he's like, oh, what a mistake this is. But he was looking to revitalize to find a place for himself in talking pictures. And in my opinion, he never found a place for himself in talking pictures. The one picture he made immediately after this, Monsieur Verdoux, was about, tell me he wasn't acting out. It was about a French serial killer who is a bigamist, and he marries women for their money and then kills them. I mean, it was sort of like, there's Joan after his money trying to kill him. Well, he's going to get back at her in film by killing every woman he comes in contact with in this movie. And it flopped. It was a terrible movie, and it flopped. Again, history has changed its view of these movies, but at the time, it went nowhere.
Some of us think that's a great movie, but...
Yeah, really? Okay. Well, at the time, no.
But what he says to the government when they condemn him to death, I'm an amateur compared to you.
Yes, that he not only goes after the women, i.e. Joan, who had wronged him, but he also goes after the government, and he says, look, you're out there killing people with a war machine, so I killed a half a dozen people. Hey, why am I the one who's going to the gallows? It's true. It's absolutely true. He does. Yes.
One of the best comments about Monsieur Verdoux is that it should be watched as a silent film. And it's got the great Martha Ray.
Oh yes, When he tries to drown her. Oh, by the way, one fun thing for this book. I think he made 84 movies in total. I have seen every single one of them. And and some of the early ones are they're just such a delight.
Do you have any speculation on why the Una marriage lasted, and how did he meet Una?
That depends on which version you want. His version is that he walked into the parlor of an agent named Mina Wallace, who was the sister of Hal Wallace, the big producer in Hollywood, and she was sitting by the fire, and she was so serene, and that Mina had introduced them because he wanted her to take over the Joan Barry role in Shadow and Substance when Joan went, but he decided that she wasn't old enough for the Joan Barry role at 17, but she was old enough to be his girlfriend at 54. Or his studio manager's version in an interview he gave before his death was that the studio manager is coming back from lunch one day, and this very attractive teenager says, "Hi, is Charlie here?" And the studio manager says, "Who are you?" She goes, "Oh, my name is Una O'Neill, and I met Charlie in New York, and he said if I ever come to California, look him up, and here I am." And the manager's having a heart attack because this is in the middle of the Joan Barry. He's like, "Oh my God, not another one." And he tries to basically fob her off on, the cameraman. So either it was a locked eyes across the room, or Charlie picked her up at a cocktail bar in New York and said, "Here, look me up." Who knows? But those are the two versions. They're both in my book. You can pick the one that you prefer to believe.
What did he do in the last 30 years of his life?
He was in Switzerland. And also, I think the marriage with, they dovetail. I think the marriage with Una O'Neill lasted because every single woman he was ever involved with wanted to be a star. And Una didn't want to be a star. She wanted to be Mrs. Charles Chaplin. And the reason, of course, she wanted that is because her own father stopped talking to her years earlier. Eugene O'Neill and Chaplin were almost the same. I think they were like a year apart. And the day she married Chaplin, O'Neill never spoke to her again after that. And so this is a girl who was looking for fatherly love and affection. She finds it with Charlie, so she doesn't want anything but his love, and that's why I think it lasted so long. For 30 years, he basically was cantankerous in Switzerland. He decides, and this is he claims to be disgusted with America, right? But he goes to Switzerland and buys an old manor, I forget what it's called, my mind is blanking. But he buys this old mansion, and what does he do? He puts in a built-in pool, he builds a barbecue, and there was a magazine article at the time that said, Una and Charlie are as Californian as two avocados. They essentially recreate California in Switzerland. They get angry. Charlie gets upset because in Switzerland it's mandatory that you get rifle training because everybody has to go into the Swiss Army, and it turns out that they do shooting in a valley that's near his house, and it keeps him up at night, and he's ticked off, so he starts complaining. It's like, Charlie, just swim in your pool and leave us alone. So that's what he does. Oh, and he writes his autobiography, which, by the way, is it's useless in terms of factual fact. It's entertaining, but factually, it's really not very close to anything. Yes.
So his daughter is Geraldine Chaplin.
That's his oldest daughter by Una. He had 8 children with Una.
And she was a successful actress.
She was a very successful actress, and some of his other children were successful too. One of the things I didn't talk about, Joan Barry's daughter cooperated with me. The Chaplin family did not. I approached them, and the Chaplin archive, which would have been the best repository of information about the Chaplins, it's filled with everything from his studios, from his life. The archive at the time, the board of directors were 7 of the 8 surviving Chaplin children, and they took a vote when I reached out, and the vote was 6-1, tell her to get lost. And that was the end of that. And I tried again later on. They didn't want anything to do with me or the book.
You said something about that you learned so much from these FBI files.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get access to that?
You can go home tonight and read them. They're on something, unless Elon Musk has taken care of that. But if he hasn't, before he does, the FBI has something called the Vault. And they have posted online the FBI files of people of interest, of prominent people. And you can get on it. It's a PDF form. And believe me, during COVID, I sat home in my pajamas and I read those things.
You can get lost in those.
You can get lost in those, you know.
So they're fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Diane Kiesel. Thank you, Michael Wolraich.